Luke, transportation right now is one part of the energy sector where a single source, currently oil, dominates. And again, Neil showed that in his presentation. And really, right now, has a pretty strong lock. Not a lock tight, but a strong lock on usage. In the U.S., for example, I think, and you'll correct me if this is off, it's about 95% of the transportation comes from oil. So can you tell us how you view this changing through time and what some of the drivers might be that would cause that to change? Thanks.
Great. Thank you, David. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's an honor to be on this panel, and thanks very much to the Climate and Energy Institute for the invitation. You know, it was nice to learn of our connection, my connection with the background that Neil has, and in the sense that we both served in the Navy. One of the things that you learn very quickly as an officer standing watch on the bridge is that when you come across a tanker or a cargo ship out in the ocean, that ship is not going to move its course for you. You're going to move for it. You know, the cruiser that I was on, typical Navy ships, were manned up to go to volatile areas and to change our way of doing business very quickly. You know, we may have, on the ship I was on, we had 600 crew members, including the officers. A tanker or a cargo ship might have 15 or a handful. And so I bring that up from the standpoint that the U.S. obviously is in a sense of the energy world, we're kind of a tanker. You know, we're a huge consumer. China is obviously coming up and passing us in ways, but we can't keep the course steady and expect everyone to move around us. We need to move more like a Navy ship and take advantage of the innovation that we can put forth and help that guide sort of the direction that we take going forward. I'm going to focus on a United States perspective, mainly because that's the area that I work in, but because of the opportunity for us to take really a strong leadership role. As Dave mentioned, you can't talk about the transportation sector and not talk about oil, you know, because it is basically the source of fuel for the transportation sector. In the U.S., the transportation sector is responsible for about 70% of the consumption of oil. And if you look at oil as a primary energy source, it is the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. From a climate perspective, why do I work on vehicles and fuels in the transportation sector? Well, the transportation sector it contributes about a third of our pollution, climate pollution nationally, and about 80% of that transportation sector emissions comes from vehicles on our roads. So understandably, they need to be an area of focus as well. I wanted to quickly sort of paint the situation of where we are and some ideas, some points ahead for what the future may look like according to some forecasts. And so the blue box here represents kind of what are expected emissions for the U.S. transportation sector from a CO2 perspective if you're just thinking about what the policies are that are in place right now. And if you look in a 2030 time frame, the red represents kind of the trajectory that we were on, the red dotted line, and you can see that we were headed towards higher emissions. And the green represents really a trajectory that we need to be on to meet an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 relative to 2005. So the fact that we're below the red means that we've made some progress. And we should recognize that and think about what it is that's gotten us there. But of course, the fact that we're still above the green means that we have quite a bit of work to do. So when we talk about, sort of how we reduce emissions and oil use in the transportation sector, we focus on, traditionally, it's a solution stool built on 3 legs. Those 3 legs are basically how much fuel our vehicles use per mile that they drive, or their efficiency. It's how much do we actually have a demand for driving, or our vehicle miles traveled. And third, it's what we put in. What's the carbon intensity of the fuel that we put in? So I'm going to touch on each of those very briefly. Here we have, in the first area, efficiency, we have a great story actually here in the U.S., and this has been a large chunk of where our emission reductions have come from. This chart here is showing the progressions from 2007 out to the present, monthly tabs on it, of what the new vehicles' fuel efficiency of the new vehicle fleet is produced in the United States. Now, this just shows the upward trend over the last, since 2007, over the last 7 years or so. But if you were to take this trend back, what you would see is that actually it was just this long, flat period for decades where we didn't increase fuel efficiency standards at all. And actually our fuel efficiency as a new vehicle fuel efficiency was going down because of the shift towards higher fuel use in basically the shift towards SUVs. So this has been a huge policy success. It's been really a landmark program of the Obama administration to put these standards in place, set over 2 stages in 2010 and 2012. But I want to Dan's point about the role of the states, this was leading into this, was that a lot of states were using authority under the Clean Air Act to set greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles leading in to this federal process, and was really a helpful push in that, Connecticut being one of the states that had adopted California's program. And so the states as a laboratory and as a push to get federal policy continues to be very important. This isn't happening just in cars and light trucks, but it's also happening in the heavy-duty sector. And right now the administration is looking at the second phase of fuel efficiency standards for heavy-duty trucks and working on that right now. And so that's going to be a major factor, one of the main pieces that's going to help us close that gap between where we are and where we need to be, even in a 2030 time frame. The VMT picture. For decades, VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, has been on a very rapid rise in the United States. But what we've seen recently is that actually questions being asked by a lot of researchers is whether or not we've sort of peaked. Are we on the way down, actually? And some folks are thinking that on a per capita basis, people are going to actually not drive more, but we actually may continue to see a decline in per capita. And with that decline in per capita, we could see a leveling off of emissions and total demand for driving. And, this is due to a lot of different factors: economics, demographics. No longer is it that everyone has to drive somewhere to meet up when everyone now has a smartphone in their pocket that can can talk to each other via the web. So, a lot of factors are at play here, but it's something that's become a real thing to study in terms of where even the Energy Information Administration is now focused on this, and that what they've looked at is that even in one of their low VMT scenarios, this could reduce petroleum consumption in the transportation sector by like 18%, just this reduced demand in driving, where historically this was just something that was going up, and up. Now, those are pretty positive stories. Let's talk about the fuel sector. Now, this is a less positive story, or let's say it's an area for a lot of opportunity. So this graphic here is emphasizing the fact that we have, as we continue to have demand for petroleum, we're going after harder to reach sources, and we're going after higher carbon intensity sources. So in this case, it's the tar sands from Canada. If that becomes a large portion of the fuel mix, that pushes our transportation sector carbon emissions in the upward direction. So basically, we're counteracting all these things that we're doing with vehicle efficiency or a shift towards electric vehicles. We're counteracting that if we move towards more high carbon intensive fuels. This graphic is focused on highlighting kind of the regional impact. Here in Connecticut and surrounding states, we get about half of our fuel supply from pipeline that comes from the Gulf and refineries from those Gulf refineries. And also we have some refineries in our region. So if tar sands gets to the Gulf, we'll get part of that. It's also as more tar sands moves by rail, or if pipelines get reversed as being talked about in Canada, then we're going to get more tar sands into our regional refineries. That's going to increase the carbon footprint of the fuel supply that we use. Just to give a sense of what that means, we have this really landmark cap and trade system, or not cap and trade, but a relatively cap and trade system on our electricity sector in the region called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Over 5 years, that's projected to reduce emissions by on the order of 11 million metric tons. If we hit what could be projected to be 18% of our fuel supply from tar sands in this region, in 1 year, that'll increase our emissions profile by 10 million metric tons. It would offset essentially what we're trying to achieve in 5 years within the electricity sector. So one of the policy levers that could be that could really help us drive forth towards innovation in the clean fuel sector is something called the Clean Fuel Standard. And what that does is it has a twofold effect. It basically says the carbon intensity of the fuel supply needs to go down over time, and it sets a standard, a performance standard, just like fuel efficiency standards for cars. This would be a carbon intensity standard for fuel. If you set a trajectory of where that has to go down, that shifts investment away from things like carbon-intensive fuels and towards things like electricity for vehicles, potentially non-fuel biomass for biofuels, hydrogen-powered electric bus here. Those examples are things where you're creating a market. So again, you're not dependent on a lot of public money, but you're creating a market that spurs that innovation. And I'm happy to talk more about that as we get to the Q&A. Finally, we have examples of where we really need to be. To meet our long-term climate and energy goals in the transportation sector, we need to shift to electric drive vehicles. The reason for that is that electric drives gives you the best efficiency, but also the fuel there, in this case, plug-in electric vehicles using electricity from the grid, it's the one fuel that's actually getting cleaner over time. We're not going to meet our long-term climate goals unless we clean up both the electricity sector and the transportation sector. So let's do that hand in hand. Let's get the vehicles out there that can actually use the cleaner electricity as we move in that direction. These are vehicles that are cleaner today, but they will only get cleaner over time. And you can't say that for any of the fossil fuel directly, liquid fuels. And this slide also points to a lot of the things that Karen started to raise, in that there's a great interaction between electric vehicles and where the electric power grid is going. And basically, when you talk about electric storage technology, every one of these cars has the potential to be an electric storage technology or to be a mobile, on-demand load that really helps manage the intermittency of renewable power. So hopefully that's a good lead-in for the discussion. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.